Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? For decades now, pretty much every game console generation has been a considerable step forward from what came before it. So does that mean that this latest console generation is the best? Alright, so we're mixing it up. We're back in the car again. I know people are going to be freaking out down in the comments because there's always a few. But anyway, this is kind of a follow-up or an expansion on a question that I was asked in my latest Q&A. And it's, what my favorite game console generation is. And that got me thinking, kind of in broader terms, is there really any one particular generation of home game console that is kind of the best overall, that the majority of people would agree is really, the best one we've seen? And so I got thinking about all the different generations of consoles and, what's really made them special or unique or the biggest impact that they've had. So I just kind of wanted to go through that with you and just kind of share my own thoughts. And of course, hopefully spur on your own thinking on this topic as well. So it all starts really, at least for me, with the 8-bit era. I'm not old enough to have grown up with really kind of the first generation, the very earliest game consoles, things like Pong or, ColecoVision, stuff like that. Those are before my time. The first console generation that I ever got into playing was the 8-bit era. Of course, specifically the NES was the biggest one. But I got a little bit of time in on a Sega Master System as well. Some neighbors that lived down the street from me had one. Kind of a funny story. I remember playing a game, like a 2-player game with them. I'd like to say it was Street Fighter. Some sort of game like that, if it wasn't Street Fighter specifically. And we were doing 2-player mode, and they were vastly better than I was at it. I was more or less just sitting there mashing buttons. But somehow we made it to the end of the game, and I don't remember the specifics because I was actually very young at the time, but there's some task you perform or some boss you beat at the end, and whoever gets the final hit in is declared the winner, of the game. The person who kind of was the first one to beat the game of the 2 players. And somehow I ended up managing to do it, and it kind of blew both of our minds because I was just sitting there mashing buttons the entire time. I just remember my neighbor sitting there going, "How did you win?" And I'm like, "I don't know." But, that's a lot of what that 8-bit era was for me. I mean, I was young. Granted, I was born in the early 80s, but, the NES came out in the mid-80s, and I was only a few years old. I never owned an NES growing up. So all the time that I had really on any game console for quite a while actually was on friends and neighbors, relatives, that sort of thing. I remember my grandparents had an Atari, was it an Atari 5200, something like that? I don't remember exactly which one it was. I have it in a box somewhere, I think. I need to dig that out. But, I'd occasionally get a little bit of pole position in on that. And I remember I hated the controllers. So it wasn't a 2600. It must have been a 5200. Anyway, so it was always just kind of this casual play for me, where it was never I'd sit down for an afternoon and play the console type of a deal. It was really more, well, I've got, 15, 20 minutes here and there, maybe an hour if I'm lucky, that sort of a thing. But even then, the 8-bit era had a big impression on me because it was so new. It was this new thing that we had never really experienced before, and for the price, it was really surprising what you got. It was really kind of like we're living in the future now because of the fact that you got color graphics and the sound and all of that in a console that wasn't ridiculously expensive. So it had a pretty big impression on me. So I think a lot of people feel the same way, and it's a contender definitely for, what someone might consider the best console generation. The one that I really started getting into, the first generation that I really sunk my teeth into was the 16-bit era. And that's because my first game console that I ever owned was a Genesis, or Mega Drive if you live outside the US. So, that's the one that I got to spend a lot of time on. Of course, the console that I really wanted was a Super NES. And if you go watch the episode that I did, it was a review of a Sega Genesis, like Model 1 AV cable. I tell the story at the beginning of that one. It's kind of a funny story, but I originally wanted a Super NES. So, I've kind of got a decent amount of interest in both of those consoles at the time. I wanted a Super NES. I got a Genesis. Don't worry, I grew to know and love the Genesis as well. And I never got a Super NES, so the people who are sitting here thinking I'm a Nintendo fanboy, just chill out. It's okay, I like them both. But that was an era that really seemed, to me at least, to kind of kick it up a notch. The graphics were that much better. The sound was that much better. The gameplay was that much more complicated. It was a major jump between, say, Super Mario 3 and Super Mario World. Not just in terms of, how it looked and how it sounded, but even the mechanics. Super Mario World, the controls, added buttons, there was more substance to it. And so I really liked the 16-bit era. Of course, it also had a really good selection of games. There are a lot of classic 16-bit era games out there, some of which are going for crazy amounts of money on the used market. Granted, of course, a lot of old video games are going for crazy amounts of money, but the 16-bit era is one that, in the very least, a lot of people seem to be kind of resonating with. And it's being reflected in those prices. So 16-bit, definitely well loved by a lot of people. What came after that is kind of the other half of the answer that I had in that Q&A episode. I listed the 16-bit era for, all the reasons that I mentioned here, but I also said my other favorite generation was the kind of pseudo 32/64-bit era, and I specifically called out the N64. The N64 was another just major leap that really kind of pushed the boundary of what gaming could be coming off the 16-bit era. Mario 64, I've talked about it before, it's my favorite console game. Not just because I think it's got really good gameplay and a really good storyline, but what it represented. It was so fresh and new at the time. And between the N64 and the PlayStation, I'd count the Sega Saturn, but it just never really took off. The Saturn's a platform that I want to get into, and I will at some point. I actually don't own one now. It's one of only a few consoles that I don't have one of. So I don't really just don't have that much experience with it. But, the PlayStation was just incredible as well. Maybe not necessarily in terms of the technology. I mean, it offered a lot, but the big thing the PlayStation had was just this huge library of good games. There were a ton of really good original PlayStation games. And, the N64, maybe the library wasn't as big, but there are definitely some perennial favorites for the N64 as well. So I think, maybe not quite as influential for as many people as the 16-bit era, but I think that third gen, the N64, PlayStation, Saturn, I think it did really well for itself. Where things started to get kind of lopsided was the generation after that. And this is where we stop really talking about how many bits the console has. The industry had kind of moved past that. And so we're talking about consoles like the GameCube, the PS2, and the Dreamcast. The GameCube, I think, in hindsight, was a much better console than people bought into at the time. The GameCube didn't sell terribly well. It just wasn't all that well loved. I'd like to say it was more due to game selection necessarily than the technology. I mean, at that point, Nintendo had started to kind of fall behind a little bit in terms of, pushing that hardware envelope. They had realized that, maybe going for just the fun to play angle was more important than trying to boast, the highest level specs. But the GameCube, I think now people are really starting to rediscover, and used prices on that are, kind of reflecting it. The Dreamcast, of course, is the real story about that era, because the Dreamcast was really one that was ahead of its time. I know a lot of people now who are just still crazy over the Dreamcast, and they will say, hands down, that was their favorite console. I never owned one back then. I do own one now, and as I'm playing it, I understand that. I understand why the that whole console, the Dreamcast, and all the accessories, and what it represented really has quite a cult following to it. And it's really too bad what happened to Sega, because had the market responded well to the Dreamcast in its time, I think Sega would have ended up in a much different position than it did. But we all know the PlayStation 2 was really just the killer console from that era. Not just because it really started, pushing the envelope in terms of graphics capability and sound and all of that, but Sony just sold a ton of consoles. And the thing that Sony did really well was making it clear you should buy the PS2 because it has a DVD player. The original Xbox had DVD functionality as well, and Microsoft, for that being a brand new console for them, being brand new to the console market, I think the Xbox did pretty decently on its own. But the PS2 really just kind of wiped the floor between the combination of Sony really pushing DVD. Hey, you should buy a PS2 if you want a DVD player. It's like about the same price, so you can play DVDs on this thing. And oh, hey, by the way, now you get a game console out of it too. That was really smart from a marketing standpoint, but the game selection just was there. Sony had picked up some franchises as part of it because it had some history with the PlayStation, so it was able to carry a lot of that history forward. And Sony, by the PS2 era, had really cemented itself as being a serious console manufacturer. It really kind of picked up where Sega left off, I feel, in terms of being a big competitor for Nintendo. The generation after that, PS3, is where things, I feel, start to kind of slow down. The Xbox 360, I will admit, as much as I prefer Sony consoles over Microsoft ones, I'm totally willing to admit that the Xbox 360 really did much better. The market responded better to the 360 than the PS3. Even though what the PS3 had going for it was Sony kind of playing that game again about, hey, do you want a Blu-ray player? You should buy a PS3. It costs about the same amount of money as just a Blu-ray player, and now you can play games on it. And the PS3 had some decent titles to it, but Xbox, that platform managed to do really, really well. The 360. I know a lot of people who didn't really play too much video games, but they bought a 360. The Wii was really the standout console from that era, but that's, in some ways, the Wii was kind of a fluke. I mean, Nintendo was smart with its marketing, but the Wii sold beyond the kind of core gaming audience. The Wii was that one console that people who normally didn't buy video games went out and bought. My own parents bought a Wii. I've talked about this before. I feel like I'm repeating myself, and sorry if I am. But, that console, in some ways, was a bit of a one-off in terms of its number of sales. I think if you look at the core gaming audience, the majority of people would say the 360 was probably, the standout console from that era, despite what the Wii U was able to accomplish on its own, especially kind of coming back after the quote-unquote failure that the GameCube was. So, the Wii, it was really starting to kind of peel off at that point where, the higher definition graphics, they just weren't a priority for Nintendo. They just wanted to really get into, gameplay is what matters the most, and, forget getting into that whole specification wars. So that brings us to the current console gen. The PS4, the Xbox One, the Wii U, and kind of the Switch, because that generation got split a little bit. And the general consensus from, I think, a lot of people is that, there's not a whole lot different from the prior gen. The Xbox One offers a bit better graphics. The PS4 offers a bit better graphics. But the gameplay experience is really very much the same. If you own a PS3 or an Xbox 360, I don't think you really necessarily need to be in a hurry to get on this latest generation unless there's, a few games that are only out for that lineup that really, really catch your interest. And I think, the Wii U, we've talked about the Wii U before and how it didn't do very well in the market. It kind of bears that out. The Wii was really what captivated people. The Wii U, aside from the whole marketing blunder, I think that Nintendo pulled with not marketing the Wii U correctly to differentiate it from what the original Wii was, people really realized, well, it's just kind of more of the same. And I think we noticed a bit of a slow start to this latest generation when it first started selling. Because of that, it really didn't differentiate itself that much. There wasn't anything really dramatically different in the way you played the games compared to the previous gen. And, the Xbox One is finally kind of getting some momentum behind it. The PS4 shot way out in front. But sales still haven't been, I don't feel like sales have been just insane for this latest gen compared to the gen before or the gen before that. I feel like it's just kind of the industry has moved on, and the people who want to play the latest games, they go out and they buy the console, but there's nothing that really kind of lights a fire for them. You know what I mean? Switch is the beginning of kind of a new, I would say, half generation of consoles, maybe. I would count the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio in as kind of this half gen, where again, it's really nothing incredibly different from what came before. I mean, 4K gaming, yeah, okay, but it's just another resolution bump like we've seen before, better performance, woohoo. Is there a new way to interface with the games? Well, Switch is trying that, but there's really nothing terribly novel about Switch. It's kind of a remix, in a way, of what Nintendo has done before. I'll say with some forward thinking, but nothing groundbreaking like what we saw with the Wii, with the whole concept of motion controls and integrating that so tightly into the game. Switch is just like you take a Wii and a Wii U and a 3DS and you mash them together, and that's kind of what you get, So definitely, I think things are slowing down. I'm not sure all that many people would say, if you look at the entire history of console gaming, this latest gen is going to be the best. But what I will say is, I don't think it's really possible to declare a so-called best generation, just because of the level of personal connection consoles tend to have with people. You know what I mean? You grow up with a certain generation of console, and because you're young and your mind is still forming and you're absorbing everything you can around you, it's always going to hold a bit of a special place, which is why the 16-bit and 32/64-bit eras hold a bit of a special place for me. That's what I grew up with. It made the biggest impression on me. Not to say that I'm not, impressed with what we're able to get out of modern consoles. I totally am. But, the answer is really going to vary based on what people grow up with. People, some younger people are going to say, well, the PS3 was the best console. Why? Well, because that's what they grew up with. That was the first console they had, that sort of thing. And ultimately, I think that's okay. I don't think there really is a right or wrong answer as to, what's the so-called best console. I think a lot of us could maybe agree that there were certain consoles or games or maybe generations that were more influential than others. But being influential doesn't necessarily make it the best. I think in the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people would say the Wii U, or the Wii rather, was very influential. Not necessarily the best. I know there's a lot of people who love to talk trash about the Wii and the Wii U, but I think a lot of people would agree that it still made a difference in the marketplace in one way or another, so it deserves recognition. So with that, I'm curious as to your thoughts. What is your favorite generation and why? Do you think we could ever get to a point, maybe if consoles ever go by the wayside, which is a different topic in and of itself, but if they ever did, do you think we would ever, get to a point where most gamers would agree a certain generation was the best? I'm curious as to your thoughts, so leave them down in the comments below. If you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnot.com. And as always, thanks for watching.